Plug in and escape. You're listening to Shifter Love. The mission was simple, but my father, the beta of the Silver Claw Pack, delivered it as if he were handing me my own death sentence. "You will cross the Ghostwood," he'd said, his voice flat and hard as the stones of our den. "You will find the Bloodfang Alpha, Cain Verrill, and you will put a silver dagger in his heart." His words echoed in my head as I moved through the twilight shadows of enemy territory. It was the night of the blood moon, the first in 50 years. The air was thick with a strange, metallic energy, and the sky was slowly bleeding into a bruised crimson. It was the perfect night for an assassination. Cain Verrill was said to be at his weakest, distracted by the rituals his pack performed under the sanguine light. He was also a monster, a cursed alpha who had supposedly murdered his own mate. Our pack's seer had prophesied that his death would break the Bloodfang's iron grip on the northern territories and restore balance. I was chosen because I was small, fast, and quiet. At 18, I was my father's best hunter, his sharpest weapon. But as I crept closer to the heart of their settlement, a grim stone fortress carved into the side of a mountain, my own heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This wasn't a rogue wolf I was hunting. This was an alpha, a legend. I found a weak spot in their patrol route, a narrow ravine choked with dead pines, and slipped through unnoticed. The fortress loomed above me, its few windows glowing like malevolent eyes. I could hear the low, guttural chanting of the Bloodfang pack from the central clearing, a primal sound that vibrated through the soles of my boots. They were all gathered for their ceremony. Cain would be there, exposed. My plan was to scale the eastern wall to a secluded balcony I'd seen on the pack's schematics, one that overlooked the ritual site. From there, I'd have a clear shot with a silver-tipped arrow. It was clean, efficient, and most importantly, it kept me at a distance. I moved like a whisper, my fingers and toes finding purchase in the rough-hewn stone. The chanting grew louder, a hypnotic, rhythmic roar that seemed to pull at something deep inside me. I ignored it, focusing on the cold weight of the dagger at my hip and the bow on my back. This was for my pack, for my family. When I finally pulled myself over the railing of the balcony, I landed in a silent crouch, my eyes scanning the scene below. The Bloodfang pack was a sea of dark fur and fierce faces, gathered around a massive bonfire that spat crimson sparks into the already red-tinged sky. And in the center, standing on a raised dais, was him, Cain Verrill. He was nothing like the gnarled, twisted monster I'd imagined. He was tall and powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a presence that commanded the entire clearing without a single word. His hair was as black as a raven's wing, and even from this distance, I could feel the sheer, oppressive weight of his authority. He wasn't chanting with the others. He was just standing there, his head tilted back, his eyes closed as he bathed in the bloody light of the moon. He looked lonely. I shook the thought away, my hand going to the quiver on my back. This was my chance. I nocked a silver-tipped arrow, my movements fluid and practiced. I drew the string back, the bow groaning softly. I took a deep breath, aimed for the center of his chest, and held it. Just as my fingers were about to release, his head snapped in my direction. His eyes opened. They were the color of molten gold, and they locked directly onto mine as if he could see through the shadows, through the stone, through my very soul. Panic seized me. He couldn't have seen me. It was impossible. But the way he was looking at me, it wasn't just sight. It was something more primal. Before I could react, he moved. He wasn't just fast. He was a blur of motion, a phantom of the night. He launched himself from the dais, clearing a dozen feet in a single bound, and began scaling the fortress wall with the terrifying ease of a spider. The pack below fell silent, their ritual forgotten as they watched their alpha ascend. My blood ran cold. I fumbled for the dagger at my hip, abandoning the bow. There was no time to escape. He was coming. He vaulted over the railing and landed on the balcony with a heavy, predatory grace. He was even larger up close. A mountain of muscle and contained fury, the air crackled with his power. I held the silver dagger out, my hand trembling despite my training. "Stay back," I hissed, my voice barely a whisper. He ignored the weapon completely. His golden eyes were narrowed, fixed on my face, his nostrils flaring as he took in my scent. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that resonated deep in my bones. "Silverclaw," he snarled, the name a curse on his lips. "They sent a pup to do a wolf's job." He took a step forward, and I lunged, aiming for his heart just as I'd been taught. He caught my wrist with impossible speed, his grip like a steel manacle. The dagger clattered to the stone floor. Forgotten, with his other hand, he grabbed my jaw, forcing my head up so I had no choice but to meet his gaze. His touch was like being branded, a searing heat that shot through my entire body. And then, something shifted in his eyes. The rage faltered, replaced by a flicker of utter, soul-shaking confusion. He stared at me, his grip tightening for a moment before it loosened. He leaned closer, his nose hovering just over the skin of my neck. He inhaled deeply, a ragged, shuddering breath. "No," he whispered, the word broken, disbelieving. "It can't be." I didn't understand what was happening. He wasn't killing me. He was just staring. His gaze was so intense, it felt like he was peeling back layers of my being, looking for something he couldn't comprehend. Then he spoke again, his voice raw with a pain so profound it stole the air from my lungs. "The fates are cruel," he breathed out, "to give me a mate who came to kill me." Mate. The word struck me like a physical blow. It was a lie, a trick. He was the cursed alpha, the one who couldn't feel the mate bond. My father had said so. Our seer had confirmed it. This had to be a ploy to lower my guard. "I'm not your mate," I spat, struggling against his grip. "You're a monster." His expression hardened again, the brief moment of vulnerability vanishing behind a mask of cold fury. "Whether you believe it or not doesn't change what you are." He growled. He released me so abruptly I stumbled back against the railing. "And you will not be leaving my territory." He seized my arm and dragged me from the balcony, through opulent corridors of dark wood and stone that felt more like a tomb than a home. He didn't speak another word. He threw me into a small, cold room in the dungeons, the heavy iron door slamming shut with a sound of absolute finality. I was left in the dark, my mind reeling. The scent of him pine, smoke, and something wild that I couldn't name clung to my skin, a phantom touch that made me shiver. For 3 desquias, I was his prisoner. I was given food and water, but no one spoke to me. I paced the small cell like a caged animal, my wolf restless and agitated beneath my skin. I could feel his presence in the fortress, a constant, heavy weight on my senses, the mate bond. If it was real, was a thread of electricity I couldn't ignore, humming with an energy that was equal parts terrifying and magnetic. Each night, he came. He wouldn't enter the cell. He would just stand on the other side of the barred door, a dark silhouette against the torchlight of the corridor. He'd watch me, his golden eyes unreadable. We never spoke. The silence was a battlefield, charged with unspoken questions and simmering animosity. I hated him for what he was, for what he'd done, but a traitorous part of me, the part that was now inexplicably linked to him, felt the crushing weight of his loneliness radiating from him in waves. On the 4th night, I decided I'd had enough. I was a warrior of the Silverclaw pack, not some damsel to be locked away. Using a loose stone, I'd worked free from the wall. I managed to break the rusted hinge on the small food slot in the door. It took hours, my fingers raw and bleeding, but I finally created an opening large enough to squeeze my arm through and jimmy the outer latch. Freedom was a heady scent on the cold night air. I slipped through the silent corridors of the fortress, a ghost in the shadows. I knew I couldn't go back the way I came. I had to find another way out, one that wasn't so heavily guarded. My instincts led me downward, toward the cavernous tunnels that ran beneath the mountain. I was almost there. I could feel a draft of cool, fresh air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The exit was close. My heart pounded with a desperate, hopeful rhythm. And then he was there. He stepped out of the darkness ahead of me, blocking the tunnel as if he were carved from the mountain itself. There was no surprise on his face, only a cold, chilling disappointment. "Did you really think you could run from me?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. My defiance surged. "I'll never stop trying," I shot back, backing away slowly. "There is nowhere you can go that I won't find you," he said. Stalking toward me, the predator was back, all traces of the conflicted male gone. "You are mine, whether you accept it or not. The bond has been awakened." I turned and ran, my feet flying over the uneven stone floor. I didn't get more than 10 paces. He caught me with a lunging tackle, his body a wall of hard muscle slamming into mine. We hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. He pinned me beneath him easily, his weight trapping me against the cold earth. I struggled, thrashing and kicking, but it was useless. He was too strong. He grabbed my wrists and pinned them above my head with one hand. "Stop fighting," he commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated through my chest. "Never!" I gasped, glaring up at him with all the hatred I could muster. A muscle twitched in his jaw. His golden eyes blazed with a fire that was part fury, part desperation. "I tried to give you a choice," he rasped. "I tried to keep my distance, but you forced my hand." He lowered his head, his lips brushing against the sensitive skin of my neck. I froze, a tremor of pure primal fear mixed with something else, something hot and electric shooting through me. His breath was warm against my skin. "If you run from me again, Lyra," he whispered, his voice a ragged promise that would haunt my dreams, "I will mark you in front of the entire pack so everyone knows who you belong to." My defiance was my undoing. "You don't own me," I choked out. "No," he murmured against my throat, and then I felt the sharp pressure of his canines against my pulse point. It wasn't a threat. It was a prelude. I felt a sharp, searing pain as his teeth broke the skin, a pain so intense it was almost pleasure. It was a white-hot flash that burned through my veins, lighting up every nerve ending in my body. It wasn't a full marking, the kind that would permanently bind our souls. It was a claim, a partial, possessive bite that screamed mine into my very essence. He pulled back, his lips stained with a bead of my blood. The pain subsided, replaced by a dizzying, intoxicating hum that connected us, a live wire of sensation stretching between his soul and mine. He stared down at me, his eyes dark with a torment I was only just beginning to understand. The incomplete mark on my neck throbbed with a life of its own, a permanent reminder that my fate, for better or worse, was now tied to the cursed alpha of the Blood Fang Pack. The days that followed the marking were a special kind of hell. The bite on my neck healed into a faint, silvery, crescent-shaped scar, but the feeling of it never faded. It was a constant, low-grade thrum against my skin, a phantom touch that served as a tether. Through it, I could feel him, not his thoughts, but his presence. His moods washed over me like tides, a distant wave of cold anger, a sharp spike of frustration, and underneath it all, a vast, desolate ocean of grief. Cain moved me from the dungeon to a chamber high in the fortress tower. It was opulently furnished with furs and dark wood, but the door was still locked from the outside. It was a gilded cage, and I hated it even more than the cold stone cell. He no longer visited me in the dark. He kept his distance, as if touching me, or even being near me. was a risk he couldn't afford to take, but I felt his eyes on me constantly, a heavy gaze from afar. I knew he was watching, always watching. My hatred for him was a solid, tangible thing. He was my captor, the enemy of my pack. But the bond was a traitor, a whisper in my blood that forced me to feel his loneliness. It was a confusing, maddening war inside my own head. I had to know why. Why would the fates pair me with a man supposedly incapable of a mate bond? Why did he call me his mate one moment and treat me like a prisoner the next? The answers wouldn't come from him, so I looked for them elsewhere. My jailer was a quiet, older she-wolf named Alara. She brought my meals and never met my eyes, her shoulders always hunched in a posture of subservience. For weeks, I tried to talk to her, but she remained silent. One day, fueled by a surge of frustration, I cornered her as she set down my tray. "Why is he like this?" I demanded, my voice raw. "Everyone says he's cursed. What is this curse?" Alara flinched, her gaze darting toward the locked door as if Cain himself could hear us. "It is not my place to speak of the Alpha's burdens," she whispered, her voice frail. "He marked me," I said, my hand instinctively going to the scar on my neck. "That makes it my burden, to... Please, I need to understand." Something in my voice, a note of genuine desperation, must have reached her. She hesitated, her old eyes filled with a deep, ancient sadness. "He was not always this way," she began, her voice barely audible. "Years ago, before he was Alpha, he found his first mate. Her name was Anya. She was sunshine. She brought light into his darkness. Anya, a first mate. The word was a punch to the gut. I hadn't even considered that possibility." Alara continued, her voice trembling. "They were deeply in love, fully mated. But the Veril line is an old one, and it carries an old curse. It lies dormant for generations. But the seers warned it could reawaken. The curse says that any Veril Alpha who truly gives their heart to their mate will see them die under the next blood moon. It's a curse of love. The more he loves, the more certain her fate." My blood ran cold. The blood moon, the night I'd arrived. "He didn't believe it," Alara said, a tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "He thought it was an old wives' tale. He loved Anya with everything he had. And on the night of the last blood moon, 50 years ago, she collapsed in his arms. She was gone by sunrise. The curse had taken her." I sank onto the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly weak. 50 years. He had lived with that for 50 years. His coldness, his cruelty, it wasn't malice. It was a shield, a fortress built around a broken heart, designed to never let anyone get close enough to be destroyed again. "He locked his heart away," Alara finished, her voice thick with sorrow. "He swore he would never love again, never feel the mate bond again. He thought that by denying it, he could keep the curse at bay. And then, you came. On the night of the blood moon, a mate he never wanted, sent to kill him. He sees you not as a gift, but as a death sentence delivered by a cruel destiny." After Alara left, I sat in silence for hours, her story replaying in my mind. The pieces clicked into place, his shock upon scenting me, his pained whisper. "The fates are cruel." His distance. He wasn't pushing me away because he hated me. He was pushing me away because he was terrified of what would happen if he didn't. The partial mark on my neck wasn't just a claim of ownership. It was a desperate, failed attempt to create a bond he could control, one that fell short of the all-consuming love that would trigger the curse. The knowledge changed everything. My anger didn't vanish, but it was now complicated by a deep, aching pity. He was as much a prisoner of his fate as I was of his fortress. The bond between us now felt different. It wasn't just a tether, it was a shared wound. I could feel the edges of his 50-year-old grief, sharp and raw, through our connection. But pity didn't mean acceptance. I was still a prisoner, and my pack still thought I was dead or, worse, a traitor. I couldn't live like this, tethered to a man who was doomed to either live alone or watch the one he cared for die. I had to sever the connection. I had to cut the mark. Silver was the only thing that could sever a bond forged by wolf magic. That night, I managed to pry the small silver inlay from the handle of a hairbrush on the vanity. It was a small, sharp shard, but it would be enough. My hand shook as I held the piece of silver to my neck, positioning the sharp edge over the crescent-shaped scar. The bond flared, a silent alarm going off in my soul. I felt a sudden, violent jolt of panic through the connection, his panic. He knew, somehow. He knew what I was about to do. I pressed the silver against my skin, a searing, white-hot pain erupting as it made contact with the magically charged scar tissue. It felt like my soul was being ripped in two. I cried out, a strangled sob, and pushed harder. This was the only way. The door to my chamber burst open, splintering off its hinges. Kane stood there, his chest heaving, his golden eyes blown wide with a terror so profound it made him look feral. He crossed the room in 2 strides, his hand clamping down on my wrist, forcing me to drop the piece of silver. It clattered to the floor, leaving a thin, bleeding line on my neck. "What are you doing?" he roared, his voice shaking with a fury that was barely masking his fear. He grabbed my shoulders, his grip bruising. "Are you insane?" "Let me go," I screamed, struggling against him. "I won't be your prisoner. I won't be your next sacrifice to this curse." "You think this is what I want," he snarled, his face inches from mine. The scent of his rage and terror was overwhelming. "You think I wanted a mate? I have spent 50 years building walls of ice around my heart, and you crashed into my life like a burning star. I am trying to save you." "By locking me in a tower, by branding me like an animal," I shot back, tears of frustration streaming down my face. "This isn't saving me. It's a slow death." I shoved against his chest, trying to put distance between us, but he held fast. "I am keeping you away from me," he yelled, his control finally shattering. "Every second I am near you, the bond grows stronger. Every time I breathe in your scent, a crack forms in the ice. I can't let it happen. I can't go through that again." His voice broke on the last words, and the sound of his anguish was so raw, so utterly devastating, that it silenced my anger. For the first time, I saw past the alpha, past the monster, and saw only the man, haunted and broken by a love he was never allowed to keep. He looked down at the bleeding cut on my neck, his expression crumbling. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of the scar, his touch so soft it was almost reverent. "Don't do that," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Please, don't ever do that again." He met my eyes, and the golden fire in them was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "If you die, I won't survive it a second time." And in that moment, standing in the ruins of my gilded cage, I finally understood. The curse wasn't just a threat to my life. It was a threat to what was left of his soul. Our fates were not just tied, they were tangled in a knot of love, death, and destiny that neither of us knew how to unravel. The fragile truce, born from Cain's confession, was shattered 2 weeks later. The horns of the blood-fanged sentinels blared through the fortress, a panicked, urgent warning, an attack. From my window, I saw them, a wave of gray and silver fur pouring out of the ghostwood, my pack, the Silver Claws. They were storming the fortress, their war cries echoing off the mountain. My father was at the front, his massive silver wolf form a beacon of righteous fury. They had come for me, or more likely, they had come to avenge me. A brutal, primal part of me soared with pride and hope, but another part, the part now tied to Cain, felt a sick, cold dread. Warriors burst into my room. "The Alpha commands you to the central keep." One of them grunted, grabbing my arm. "You are to be kept under guard." They dragged me through corridors filled with the sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the snarls of wolves, the screams of the wounded. The central keep was a massive, fortified chamber deep within the mountain where the pack's elders, pups, and non-combatants were sheltered as I was shoved inside. I caught a glimpse of Cain. He was on the main rampart, a whirlwind of dark fury, cutting down my pack members with a grim, lethal efficiency. He was protecting his people, and a traitorous voice in my head whispered, "He is protecting you." The battle raged for hours. The keep was filled with the terrified whimpers of children and the low, anxious growls of the elders. I felt every wound my pack suffered as a distant pang, but I felt every blow Cain took as a sharp, personal agony through the bond. He was being overwhelmed. My father was a brilliant strategist, and the Silver Claws were fighting with the ferocity of a pack who believed their beta's daughter had been murdered. Then, a tremor ran through the bond, a spike of pain so intense it brought me to my knees. I cried out, clutching my chest. It was a crippling, debilitating agony, a silver wound, I knew, with a certainty that terrified me, that he was gravely injured. Without a second thought, I acted. I was no longer a prisoner. I was a force of nature. I slammed my elbow into the throat of the guard nearest me, snatched the dagger from his belt, and held it to the throat of an elder she-wolf. "Get out of my way!" I snarled, my voice a low growl I didn't recognize as my own. "Let me through or she dies." The other wolves hesitated, their eyes wide with shock. They saw the desperation in my face and parted, allowing me to pass. I ran from the keep, back into the heart of the battle. The main courtyard was a scene of carnage. Bodies of both packs littered the stones. I saw my father, his wolf form bleeding from a dozen wounds, standing over a fallen Cain. Cain was on his back, a silver dagger buried deep in his shoulder, smoke curling from the poisoned wound. His breath was coming in ragged gasps, his golden eyes glazed with pain. My father raised his head to the sky and let out a triumphant howl. He was about to deliver the killing blow. "No!" The scream was ripped from my throat. I launched myself at my father, a frantic, desperate blur. He turned, his eyes wide with shock at seeing me alive. "Lyra!" There was no time to explain. I slammed my body into his side, knocking him off balance just as another blood-fang wolf charged him, drawing his attention away. I dropped to my knees beside Cain, my hands hovering over the silver dagger. It had to come out, or the poison would stop his heart. "Lyra!" he rasped, his eyes finding mine. There was no anger, no command, just a pained, weary confusion. "What are you doing?" "Saving you, you idiot," I muttered, gritting my teeth. I gripped the hilt of the dagger. "This is going to hurt." I pulled. He roared, a sound of pure agony that shook the very stones beneath us, and then his eyes rolled back in his head as he lost consciousness. I knew I couldn't stay here. My pack would see me as a traitor, and his pack would never trust me. I had to get him away. Adrenaline surged through me. I hooked my arms under his and began to drag him, his dead weight a monumental effort. I pulled him away from the main battle, toward a secondary gate that led into the dense forest of the borderlands. For hours, I half dragged, half carried him through the woods. He was fading, the silver poison working its way through his system. He was burning up with fever, muttering deliriously. I found a shallow cave hidden behind a waterfall, a place I knew from my childhood explorations of the border territories. It was damp and cold, but it was hidden. I laid him down on the cave floor, my body aching and exhausted. I cleaned his wound as best I could with water from the stream and strips of my own tunic, but his fever was getting worse. His skin was scorching hot, and violent shivers racked his powerful frame. The wolf inside him was fighting the poison, a battle that was tearing him apart. As night fell, he grew worse. He thrashed in his fevered state, his eyes glowing gold in the darkness. The coherence he'd briefly shown was gone, replaced by a primal delirium. His growls were no longer human. They were the guttural rumbles of a beast in pain. "Mine!" he snarled, his hand shooting out and grabbing my wrist. His grip was impossibly strong. He wasn't seeing me. Lyra. He was seeing his mate. This wasn't Cain. The cold, controlled alpha. This was the wolf. The beast that lived beneath his skin. Stripped of all reason and logic by pain and fever, all it knew was instinct, and its primary instinct was to claim and protect what belonged to it. "You think you can fight this?" he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly sound that was barely human. He pulled me closer, his other arm wrapping around my waist, trapping me against his fever-hot body. "You think you can resist what you are, made of mine?" I was pinned, my back against the rough cave wall, his body a furnace against mine. His face was inches away, his golden eyes blazing with a raw, untamed hunger. Fear should have been my first reaction. I should have fought him, struggled to get away from this wild, unpredictable animal. But I didn't. Staring into the eyes of the beast, I saw not a monster, but a creature in exquisite agony, clinging to the one thing that anchored it to the world, me. The bond between us was a raw, open nerve, and through it, I could feel the desperate, terrified core of his wolf. It was afraid of dying. It was afraid of being alone. Slowly, carefully, I raised my free hand and laid it against his cheek. His skin was burning, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into my touch, a low, shuddering sound rumbling in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression. It was a sound of need, of surrender. For a moment, the fire in his eyes softened. The beast quieted, soothed by a touch it had been denied for half a century. The world seemed to shrink to the space between us, the damp air of the cave, the sound of the waterfall outside, the frantic beating of my own heart. He lowered his head, his lips finding mine. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was rough, desperate, and possessive. A kiss born of fever and instinct and 50 years of repressed longing. It was a brand, a claim, a desperate plea, and to my own shock, I kissed him back. I met his desperation with my own, a silent acknowledgement of the undeniable pull that had existed between us from the very first moment. In that instant, there was no silver claw, no blood fang, no curse, no history. There was only him and me, two souls caught in a destiny neither of us had chosen but could no longer deny. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. He rested his forehead against mine, his ragged breathing evening out. The beast was retreating, soothed. As I caught my breath, a sharp, stinging pain flared on my neck. I gasped, my hand flying to the partial mark he'd given me. It felt like it was on fire. I looked down at my reflection in a small puddle of water on the cave floor. The faint, silvery crescent scar was no longer silver. It was glowing with a soft, crimson light, slowly transforming. The ends of the crescent were extending, curving into a circle. It was taking the shape of a blood-red moon. The curse wasn't broken. It hadn't been dormant. It had been waiting. And now, with the first true, undeniable acknowledgement of our bond, it was waking up. Cain's fever broke the next morning. The beast receded, leaving the man in its place weary, wounded, but lucid. He woke to find me watching him, my expression a mixture of fear and grim resolve. He sat up slowly, his hand going to the now clean wound on his shoulder. "You saved me," he said, his voice raspy. It wasn't a question. "You were dying," I replied, my tone flat. I couldn't bring myself to look at him. Instead, I stared at the crimson mark on my neck in the reflection of the water. He followed my gaze, and a sharp intake of breath was his only response. He knew what it meant. The spreading red glow was an omen, a countdown timer made of magic and blood. The curse had found its new target. "It's transferring," he whispered, horror dawning in his eyes. "To you." The quiet finality of his words hung in the air between us. We both understood the terrifying implication. The curse was tied to his love, by saving him, by kissing him, by acknowledging the bond even for a moment. I had given the ancient magic a new vessel. If we completed the mate bond, I would die at the next blood moon. If we tried to sever it, the trauma would likely shatter what was left of his soul. We were trapped. "There has to be a way," I said, more to convince myself than him. "There's always a way." Kane's face was a mask of grim despair. "For 50 years, I have searched. My pack has sought every scholar, every seer. They all say the same thing: the curse cannot be broken. It can only be endured or passed on." "They're wrong," I insisted, a stubborn fire igniting within me. I refused to be a victim of some ancient, malevolent magic. I thought of the stories my grandmother used to tell, whispers of old magic, of beings who lived outside the laws of the packs. There is one person they wouldn't have asked: Marin the Hermit. Kane's head snapped up. "The Mad Witch of the Ashen Peaks. She's a myth, a children's story to scare pups." "She's real," I said with certainty. "My grandmother saw her once. She lives beyond the territories, and she deals in magic that alphas and seers have long forgotten. If anyone knows how to break a curse of blood, it's her." Desperation was a powerful motivator. A myth was a better option than certain death. After a day of rest, with Kane strong enough to travel, we left the relative safety of the cave and began the treacherous journey into the Ashen Peaks. For 3 days, we walked in a tense silence, the unspoken feelings from our kiss in the cave hanging between us like a shroud. The glowing mark on my neck was a constant reminder of the stakes. We found Marin in a hut made of petrified wood and bone, perched on a cliff edge overlooking a sea of clouds. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes the color of a stormy sky. She looked at us as we approached, and a slow, knowing smile spread across her lips. "A Varl alpha and a silver claw pup," she cackled, her voice like stones grinding together. "And both of you reek of destiny's cruelest joke. I have been waiting for you." We told her everything: the curse, the first mate, the partial mark, the battle, and the crimson glow now spreading across my skin. She listened patiently, her cloudy eyes seeming to see right through us, into the tangled threads of our fate. When we were done, she was silent for a long time. Then she spoke, her words heavy with the weight of old magic. "Blood curses are not easily undone," she said. "They are tied to the very essence of your being. This one feeds on the love of a mated pair and the power of the wolf spirit. To break it, you must starve it of one of its meals." She looked from Kane to me, her gaze lingering. "The price is this: one of the two who bear the mark of the blood moon must sacrifice their wolf." The air in the hut grew cold. To sacrifice one's wolf was to become human, to lose the strength, the speed, the healing, the senses, to lose the other half of one's soul. It was a fate worse than death for most of our kind. "One of us has to give up our wolf," Kane asked, his voice strained. "Permanently," Marin confirmed. "You will sever your connection to the moon, to the pack, to the very spirit of your people. You will become a mundane, frail, mortal. But the curse, unable to feed on the wolf spirit of both mates, will wither and die." We left Marin's hut with the terrible choice weighing us down. Kane was an alpha. His wolf was his power, his identity, the lifeblood of his pack. He couldn't sacrifice it. But I was a warrior, a hunter. My wolf was my pride, my heritage. How could I give it up? That night, as we camped in the shadow of the peaks, Kane finally spoke. "I will do it," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I am the one who carries the Varl name, the This is my burden to bear. I looked at him, at the resignation in his eyes, and I saw a man ready to sacrifice everything to undo the sins of his ancestors. But I also saw the truth. A Bloodfang pack without its alpha wolf would crumble. It would be torn apart by challengers from within and enemies from without. His sacrifice would save me, but it would doom hundreds of his people. And in that moment, I made my own choice, quietly, secretly. I knew he would never agree. He would try to stop me, to take the burden on himself, so I didn't tell him. The next blood moon was only a week away. We returned to the borderlands, living as fugitives in the wilderness. He spent his days watching me, his gaze full of a tortured affection he no longer tried to hide. I spent my time memorizing the ritual Marin had taught me, a quiet prayer to the moon goddess, a plea to take my wolf spirit in exchange for his life. The night of the blood moon arrived. Painting the sky in violent shades of red and orange, a storm was brewing, both in the heavens and in our souls. Cain was restless, pacing our small campsite like a caged lion. He thought we still had time to decide. He didn't know I had already chosen. "Stay here," I told him, my voice steady despite the tremor in my soul. "I need to be alone for a moment." He looked at me, his golden eyes searching my face. "Lyra, don't do anything foolish." "I won't," I lied. I walked to a small clearing a short distance away, the crimson moonlight bathing the world in an eerie glow. The mark on my neck burned with a fierce, consuming heat. I could feel the curse reaching its apex, hungry for a life to claim. I knelt on the ground, closed my eyes, and began the ancient rite. I spoke the words Marin had given me, a soft chant that was both a plea and a command. I offered my wolf my strength, my spirit, my other half to the moon. I felt a tearing sensation deep inside me, as if my soul were being ripped from my body. The pain was unbearable. "If fate has decreed that one of us must die for love," I whispered to the blood-red sky, my voice breaking, "then let me die in his place." "Lyra!" Cain's roar of pure terror ripped through the night. He had followed me. He burst into the clearing, his face a mask of horrified understanding. He saw me kneeling, my body shaking, the mark on my neck glowing like a hot coal. He saw what I was doing. I collapsed, the pain overwhelming me, my vision blurred. The last thing I saw was Cain lunging toward me, his eyes blazing with a desperate, wild love. He crashed to his knees beside me, pulling me into his arms. The curse was at its peak, a malevolent presence seeking to claim its prize. He didn't hesitate. He looked into my fading eyes, his own filled with tears. "I will not lose you," he vowed, his voice a ragged growl. And in a final, desperate act of love and defiance, he lowered his head and sank his teeth into the burning mark on my neck. Completing the bite, he pushed his own life force, his own alpha spirit, his very soul into me, marking me fully in a last-ditch effort to anchor me to the world, to fight the curse with the only power he had left. A blinding white light erupted from the mark, engulfing us both. I felt a surge of power, his power, and then an unbearable tearing sensation. It was the sound of a soul being ripped in two, and I didn't know if it was his or mine. Then, everything went dark. I awoke to the gentle sound of birdsong and the scent of damp earth. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the absence of sound, but an internal quiet I had never experienced before. The constant, low hum of my wolf, the second presence that had shared my mind, my senses, and my soul for my entire life was gone. There was just me. The hollowness was staggering, a phantom limb I could no longer feel. I opened my eyes. I was lying on a soft bed of moss and ferns inside a small, rustic cabin. Sunlight streamed through a single, clean window. Cain was sitting in a wooden chair beside me, his head in his hands. He looked diminished, The overwhelming, oppressive aura of an alpha was gone. The raw power that had crackled in the air around him had been replaced by a quiet, weary strength. He looked up as I stirred, and the relief that flooded his face was so profound it was heartbreaking. He rushed to my side, his hands hovering over me as if he were afraid I might shatter. "Lyra," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "What happened?" I asked, my own voice feeling small and strange in the silence of my mind. "The curse is broken," he said softly, his thumb gently stroking my cheek. You tried to take it all on yourself. The ritual, it was killing you. When I completed the mark, I tried to force my own energy into you, to fight it. It created a backlash. The curse fed on the turmoil, on the alpha power I poured into the bond. It took its payment. He guided my hand to my neck. The skin was smooth. The mark, both the partial and the full, was gone. There wasn't even a scar. Then he took my hand and placed it on his own shoulder, where the silver wound had been. The skin was healed, but it was just skin. There was no trace of the accelerated healing all of our kind possessed. "It took my alpha status," he explained, his voice heavy. "The core of my power was burned away to fuel the breaking of the curse. I'm less. And your wolf." He couldn't finish the sentence. The guilt in his eyes was too great. "It's gone," I finished for him, the reality of it finally sinking in. I'm human. The word felt foreign, wrong. But as I looked at him, at the man who had lost his birthright to save me, I didn't feel the grief I expected. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The war was over. We were exiles. He was no longer fit to lead the Bloodfang pack, and I was a traitor to the Silver Claws. We were packless, adrift. We found this abandoned hunter's cabin on the far side of the Ashen Peaks, a place where the laws of wolves held no sway. Here, we started a new life, one defined not by status or power, but by quiet, simple moments. He taught me how to set snares for rabbits, a skill I'd never needed when I could run them down myself. I taught him how to bake bread over a fire, a domestic task an alpha would never have known. We were no longer alpha and prisoner, predator and prey. We were just Cain and Lyra. Some nights, we would hear the distant howling of a wolf pack on the wind. I would see a flicker of longing in his eyes, a memory of the power he'd lost. He was still a werewolf, but his connection to the pack collective, the very thing that made an alpha, had been severed. He was a lone wolf in the truest sense. But then he would turn and look at me, and the longing would fade, replaced by a deep, unwavering certainty. He had made his choice. One evening, we sat outside our cabin, watching the full moon rise, a perfect silver disk in the dark sky. It no longer held any power over me. It was just a light in the sky. I reached up and touched the smooth skin on my neck where the mark had been. "The blood moon took my wolf," I said softly, my voice carrying on the gentle breeze, "but it couldn't take the part of my heart that you marked." Cain turned to me, his golden eyes still as captivating as ever, holding mine. He took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. His touch was warm, solid, and real. "I spent 50 years running from fate," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur. "I thought the mate bond was a curse, a chain that would only lead to pain. I was wrong. The curse wasn't love. The curse was being afraid to love." He leaned in and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to the spot on my neck where his claim had once been. The phantom limb of my soul ached for a moment, a memory of what was lost. But the warmth of his lips, the steady beat of his heart against my hand, that was what was real. That was what remained. He pulled back, his forehead resting against mine. "Even without the bond," he whispered, his words a vow stronger than any magic. "Even if you were never my mate, you would still be my destiny." And under the light of an ordinary moon, In the quiet of our shared exile, I knew he was right. We were no longer the cursed Alpha and his fated sacrifice. We were just two survivors who had found their home not in a pack or a territory, but in each other.